Hence, vain deluding joys, the brood of folly without father bred, how little you bested, or fill the fixed mind with all your toys. Dwell in some idle brain, and fancies fond with gaudy shapes possess, as thick and numberless as the gay motes that people the sunbeams, or likest hovering dreams the fickle pensioners of Morpheus train. These are the words with which Milton begins his companion poem, Il Penseroso. We looked last time at his work, L'Allegro, and I suggested that the two poems presented two, not just what we would call psychological dispositions, but forms of life, both of which Milton seems to be validating and at the same time questioning. And in keeping with the Renaissance ideal of balance and equity and equipoise, he is exploring something in a way that we find rather unprecedented in English literature. The reference at the end to Morpheus, by the way, which unfortunately is now known largely through that movie, gosh, what's it called? The Keanu Reeves movie. Morpheus is the god of dreams, and he is dismissing wholesale the claims that L'Allegro had made of his divine parentage, but more to that in a minute. This is a great poem, Il Penseroso, although no more great than the one that preceded it, I think. It does follow the same structure as L'Allegro, and it was probably composed later. And what is interesting about it is that it imitates everything about the poem, more or less, and yet with a diametrically opposed and indeed antithetical approach to all of the topics concerned. And nonetheless, seems equally as persuasive in its power. It begins, as I just read, with the same sort of apotropaic proem at the outset, but unlike the previous poem, there is no genealogy. There's simply the dismissal of the idea that the other had a genealogy. There is no divine source for the cheerful life. The divine source, if there is any, is simply in dreams, and dreams here are dismissed. There are various types of dreams understood in the medieval world. These are the dreams of delusion, the sort that Shakespeare dismisses in A Midsummer Night's Dream. There are a variety of dream types that he entertains there as well. So there is no birthplace for melancholy. He banishes all such thoughts. And instead, he so no birthplace from mirth. These are in fact deluding joys, wholly illusory. And when he comes to the tetrameter of the poem, which is the same meter that he uses for L'Allegro, and hails the goddess Melancholy, he cites her legendary associations, and he cites two here. He cites Memnon and Cassiopeia. Now, Memnon, Milton drawing on his classical knowledge here, Memnon is an Ethiopian king mentioned in the Iliad. He is almost the equivalent of Achilles in terms of his greatness. And Memnon's sister was said to be black. Remember, he's the Ethiopian king. And Cassiopeia was the queen of Ethiopia, and said to be the daughter of Andromeda, and more beautiful than the Nereids, and for which reason she was placed into a constellation. And so we learn that there's a genealogy here, and an ancient genealogy to melancholy, born of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, by the way, the Vestal Virgins, and hence of the household, and also of Saturn. So this is her divine parentage. The father of the Olympian gods is Saturn, including, and that includes that of Jupiter or Jove, who eventually usurped him. So reaching back before the Olympian gods is what Milton is doing here in his invocation of the parentage of the of melancholy here, and therefore outdoing or outclaiming the vintage, the antiquity of melancholy's line. So she's fundamental to the whole metaphysical order of the cosmos. And so this is a direct rejoinder to the claims that had been made by in Allegro to the parents of Mirth, who are said to be Venus and Bacchus. Well, these are just minor gods by comparison. I'm referring in melancholy to the gods that of Saturn that preceded them, the father of the father of gods and men, Jupiter, namely Saturn. So those are the terms with which he begins the as I say, the apotropaic proem here in Il Penseroso, and they are a direct companion to be compared and contrasted with that in Allegro. And what we will see here presented in various ways. It struck me last time that I should have said a bit more on this, but I can remedy that now. There's a great deal of reference here to musing, contemplation, in both poems, interestingly, but also the importance of music. I think I cited in the my reflections on L'Allegro on the importance of freedom. And the freedom I mentioned in political terms in particular places is a hard-won freedom, and yet joyful, that of the shepherd. But the shepherd's freedom is the freedom simply from the hard labor that attends the shepherd's life. And there were various places in which liberty was particularly associated historically, in which life was rather difficult, it must be said. Athens being one, the Swiss Alps being another, and in general, in both cases associated with democracy. Calvin's Geneva being rather more democratic. There is no monarch in Geneva in Calvin's day, and the Swiss cantos and so forth. So the setting there leads to a rather, not just the rustic life, but a very hard existence, and sort of a fierce independence and liberty that attends it. But that's a corollary, or rather a consequence, of the liberty from labor. And the liberty from labor is used for a particular purpose. It's just, the Latin word is otium, O-T-I-U-M. And that's just a sort of a useless sort of time. It's not used for any particular purpose, and it can be understood in a derogatory sense as just free time. But Milton has that free time for something different. And we noted that in the plowman, the form of the plowman in Allegro, he whistles during this time, and the milkmaid sings. And those responses to their free time are telling in the context of Milton's understanding of cosmology and of music and of the order of things. And I wanted to just take an instant to talk once again about a theme consistent in Milton's literary corpus, I think, of the significance of music in relation to the cosmos and the order of things. And Milton, when he is talking about music, is drawing upon a long tradition of understanding that goes at least, it goes back to Pythagoras, really, and in Plato, who thought that there was a direct correlation between the music, people's music, and their adherence to freedom and to order. So I believe it's in the Laws that Plato says if you want to destroy a country, you change its music, which seems a rather odd sort of statement, but I think is rather profound, and it is connected to his understanding that music is connected to mathematics and order. But it's picked up in those classical Greek authors, and their themes are picked up by a Christian author that Milton would doubtless know. As I say, his father was a composer of music, a minor composer, and Milton himself received an extensive musical education. The Christian author was named Boethius. Now, Boethius we know primarily, if we know him at all, through his work on the consolation of philosophy, which is not even explicitly a Christian work. But Boethius himself was a Christian, and a Christian who was extensively connected in politics. His sons were prominently placed in the Roman Empire at the very height of the political order, in fact. And he was a vastly influential man who was thrown in prison. But this treatise, De Institutione Musica, is less well known. And I want to mention it very briefly here, because I think it is absolutely key. And because in this treatise, what he does is he summarizes ancient Greek thought on music, and he describes the Pythagorean unity of mathematics and music. Now, the unity of mathematics and music is connected to the frequency that exists audibly perceived, so through the empirical means of the senses, that reflects the mathematical precision that we can measure between musical notes. And he notes further how Plato had related music to society. And so with that knowledge, education, paideia, from the time of Boethius onwards, and certainly going on through the time of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, was united around the idea of the Quadrivium. The Quadrivium, by the way, a term that Boethius himself introduces in the De Descriptione or De Institutione Arithmetica, so the principles of music. So a hugely influential treatise. So the Quadrivium, by the way, pardon me, is a word for the 4 ways, of learning. Now, there are 7 ways, in fact, because in addition to the Quadrivium, we have the trivium, the 3 ways. Now, the 3 ways of words are that of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The 4 ways of what we would call science or of number are that of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, and they're interrelated. And so when Milton is speaking here of music, he's drawing upon something more important than simply music. He's introducing the idea of a harmony that unites things. And what sort of things do they unite? Well, we've already seen something of that in my mention of the fact that Plato believes that there's a relationship between music and society. What we need to understand how this connects with astronomy, a theme that Milton has already mentioned in the first work we looked at, Ode on the Evening of Christ's Nativity, is a correlation between 3 types of music. And what are these 3 types? Well, one is the music of the spheres. This is a music which is not audible to the ear, but can be understood rather than heard, and it can be understood because it explains how the planets correspond or relate to the musical scale, the eightfold musical scale that Pythagoras understood and is the basis, the foundation for Western music. So there's that music, that silent music, the music of the spheres, which in C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, we don't hear because of sin. He's implicitly referring to that. Is the term for that in Latin is musica mundana, from which we derive the word mundane. There's nothing mundane about this music. This is the music of the spheres, or the music of the world. Mundana is the world. That has two other correspondences. The one is the moral, social one that Plato is referring to, and that is the musica humana. Just think human and add an A to it. And now that is the harmony of the human body and the human spirit. So there's a correspondence between the music of the spheres that we cannot hear. It's a mathematical precision, it's an order, it's a perfection represented in the constellations above us, to the right relation of spirit, of soul and body. That's the musica humana. That is something that unites things and means that we are in perfect order ourselves, in our souls, in our spirits, in our psyches. And that is connected to a third type of music, and it's the type of music that contemporary scholarship tends only to understand, and that is the musica instrumentalis, instrumental music. And the instrument there could be a musical instrument that we would pick up, a violin, a piano, a guitar, whatever you would choose to play as the instrument, or even the human voice. That is an instrument, the voice. But that the human voice, in Milton's understanding, from the singing or the whistling of the shepherd to the singing of the milkmaid, corresponds and reflects a harmony of their body and soul, which in turn reflects the order of and the constellation of the planets. And this is not just a subjective thing. This is the problem and the reason I need to spend so much time talking about this here, is because when we think of music, we think of something intensely subjective, related to the passions, but in no way connected to something which is related to mathematics or anything precise, anything objective. This is not Milton's understanding. And so we need to understand, behind Milton's references to music, an order and a right order, which right reason will also intuit and understand. And remember, this is connected with freedom. And we could further juxtapose something which I'll talk on at greater length when we come to Paradise Lost, the fundamental discord or noise of Satan's pandemonium, a word that we associate to this day simply with noise, but is actually a reference to a tower, the house of all the devils. It's a sort of a city built in hell, but it's associated with pure noise. There is no music there. There is no logic there. There is no reasoning there. There's no purchase there on what Milton and his Christian audience understood, to include the classical audience, will understand as something which is orderly, in which we can live without total destruction of our souls. So that is underlying both poems. It's not simply that of Allegro, it's also here in Il Penseroso, when he refers to leisure or freedom, the freedom from the toils of the body. It is in order to engage in the Vita Contemplativa, which interestingly he doesn't only associate with melancholy, but also with the life of Allegro, the cheerfulness. Again, in Plato's thought, those two are separated in the mouth of Socrates and thereafter, and Aristotle identifies them, as I said, the bios politicus on the one hand and the bios theoreticus on the other hand, which becomes the vita activa and the vita contemplativa on the other hand, get starkly dissociated, so that there is an active life in which one goes around and does important political deeds, the active man in the world, as opposed to the contemplative life of the philosopher slash theologian. Milton is not going to have that stark dissociation. He's breaking those sharp distinctions, and he is marrying the two and suggesting that both are possible, both for the active life, the cheerful life of the L'Allegro, and also for that of the pensive life or the melancholic life of Il Penseroso. And melancholy indeed here is invoked as a pensive nun in Il Penseroso. And it's interesting that he does that because in Milton's time, there had not been a nun seen in England for 100 years. But all the same, he's using it as an analogy, as a symbol. She's described as being, later on in lines 31 and 32, as being devout and pure, sober, steadfast, and demure. And wrapped in holy passion, she forgets herself and is almost presented in terms of a marble statue. And this is just, I mentioned his poem dedicated to Shakespeare. Shakespeare had envisaged those readers as marble figures on a tomb, immortalized by thought. So remember those lines. I'll quote them here. Then thou our fancy of itself bereaving, dost make us marble with too much conceiving. So the image that he used in his dedication to Shakespeare's poetry, he is now retrieved here and is utilizing for the purposes of describing the life of contemplation, of melancholy. There's also, it must be said, alongside melancholy, a train of personifications. If I said that, mentioned at the outset, there's a reference to Vesta, bright-haired Vesta, long of yore, line 24, the goddess of the hearth, the virgin daughter of Saturn. And it's scholars are unclear where Milton gets this lineage, but all the same, she is referred to as one of the Vestas, and the Vestas are virgin, but here they have a train. She's presented not just as the goddess of the hearth, but as a queen-like figure, because she has there are a variety of attendants that surround her, and which are allegorical personifications: peace, quiet, fasting, leisure, and again, I think implicitly wealth. Now, this is interesting because, as I said, back in L'Allegro, there was a reference to liberty attending a rather more impoverished state, that of the bucolic ideal of the shepherds and the milkmaids. Milton leaning back on classical ideals there of Theocritus and so forth from his odes or his idylls. But here he is referring to the state of leisure, which is the basis of made on the basis of wealth. And this is the reality for most people who have leisure, is that they have the financial means in order to not be laboring at all times. And leisure is the very basis of culture. And there's an interesting book that was written, gosh, I'm not sure how many years ago now, that described exactly this very thing, that leisure, that very thing which our society never seems to achieve, but what we is nonetheless an ideal. We want to be freed from work in order to have time to ourselves. But the time to ourselves is not used for the sake of leisure, it is used for the sake of entertainment. And entertainment is, at least in the understanding of Milton and his whole Christian forebears, is something that is a distraction. It's a spiritual lure. It's a snare. We don't need to be entertained. We need to contemplate the significance and the meaning of things. So having free time and using it up for playing video games or whatever have you do with your free time, that's not what is meant by leisure here. Leisure here is connected to contemplation, and contemplation to eternal truth. And it is the very basis of culture. There can be no culture without a society which values leisure and with that contemplation. Now, the irony in a day such as ours, where we have such enormous material wealth, is that very few use that material wealth to devote themselves to the contemplation of truth and beauty and goodness and such things as our forebears would invariably have used their leisure for. We use it instead for relaxation. These are strange new categories, which I don't want to get into here. But the climax of these allegorical personifications is the word silence. Peace, quiet, fasting, leisure, contemplation, silence. Now, when he comes to silence, silence here is meant in not to deny everything I just said about the importance of music. It's to listen to the music of the spheres. The silence, the spheres that can't be heard. He's clearing the space of the temple of the Vestal Virgin from all clutter, all impediments. It's the basis of prophetic vision. It's being close to God. That's what he has in mind here. Contemplation in the form of a prophetic vision, like that of Ezekiel. And he actually concludes the poem itself with a reference to 174, something like prophetic strain, that which inspired the prophet Ezekiel when he began his works of prophecy, and among other things saw the chariot of fire. This figure of silence that he mentions here is hissed, to use his word, along for the sake of contemplation, unless the nightingale sings. Now, the nightingale that Milton refers to here is picked up by other writers, the most famous of which may be John Keats in his Ode to a Nightingale. And Keats was doubtless, at least to my mind, mindful of Milton's poem when he was writing his own great ode, and the odes are themselves a poetic form, which by this point in European literature was often associated with the sublime, and certainly with contemplation, but here in Milton, less strongly associated with the sublime, because the sublime, as the Romantics understood it, did not yet exist as a category, but that's its own particular sphere of thing. But there is the note, the Ezekiel reference I mentioned in 153, the fiery wheeled throne, the cherub contemplation, and the mute silence hissed along. Less Philomel will deign a song in her sweetest, saddest plight, smoothing the rugged brow of night, while Cynthia checks her dragon yoke gently o'er the accustomed oak. Sweet bird that shunts the noise of folly, most musical, most melancholy. Now again, these slighting references back to l'Allegro, the noise of folly. It shuns those things. So again, there's the poem began with this hence, as in get that out of my thoughts, get that out of my presence, because here is the real path. Note that both proclaim that the path they are on, either that of the cheerful approach or the melancholic approach are the true one, and the antithesis is the exact opposite. The other is a vain, deluding joy. This is most musical, claims melancholy, most melancholy. And then he invokes the references to the chantress, oft the woods among, I woo to hear thy even song rather. And missing thee, I walk unseen on the dry, smooth, shaven green to behold the wandering moon riding near her highest noon. Now note that he's referencing the moon here. Now the moon in the Ptolemaic cosmology and the whole Christian understanding that attends that is affected by the same sinful incursion as is planet Earth, for which reason it waxes and wanes, it changes, and for which reason everything beneath the influence of the moon cannot hear the celestial music, the musica mundana that I mentioned at the outset. But here Milton associates even the moon under the guise of melancholy with contemplation in mind to be able to nonetheless lead him in the right form of thinking on the topic. He can behold the wandering moon riding near her highest noon, when she's at her fullest, a full moon. Like one, and conventionally, that would be drawing him into madness. He would be under the influence of the moon, the lunae, and therefore would be subject to lunacy. The star-crossed lovers of Romeo and Juliet. Romeo swears by the moon, and Juliet asks him, no, swear not by the moon, swear rather by the sun, because the sun doesn't change. And I don't want your love to change. I want your love to be like eternal love, immutable. But here Milton moves away from that towards a more ideal version of contemplation that is normed by the musica mundana. Riding near her highest noon, back to the text, to behold the wandering moon riding near her highest noon, like one that had been led astray through heaven's wide pathless way. Again, reference to the spheres. And oft as if her head she bowed, stooping through a fleecy cloud. Oft on a plat of rising ground I hear the far-off curfew sound. Over some wide-watered shore, swinging low with sullen roar. Note again all of the references to sound here. It would be very easy in our attendance to the sights that Milton presents before us to ignore the sounds. But note that with Milton's masterful artfulness in poetic design here, he contrasts the cheerfulness and the sprightliness of the measure of Allegro with the sense of spaciousness and distance and openness here in Il Penseroso. The moon is like one that has been led astray through the heavens wide, pathless way. We get the sense of expansiveness, of limitless, the sense that will eventually be associated with the sublime. And this rhyme of hath and astray and path and way moves from the long A to the short A. Hath, short, astray, long. Path, short, way, long. This sense of from the alpha to the omega. And in this, he lengthens the sound even. So this is just magnificently artful, poetic construction. And then moves on through the forest at night, hearing across the body of water from a town, across a lake, the bell of a curfew, calling its citizens indoors. And we have something, again, of the sense of incantation around the whole poem. And that sense, which Jeffrey Teskey, in his article on the Cambridge Companion of Milton, argues is there in both poems, and I agree with him most strongly. And for the reasons which I've just tried to embellish, that is its connection with Boethian understandings of music. Without that understanding, we simply are missing the point. This isn't just simply Milton showing his aesthetic prowess to us. He's making a philosophical and theological statement. And it's really interesting how other authors will pick up on this, but often miss the importance of this, the connection between music and God. Tolkien certainly was not oblivious to it. In his little work, the Silmarillion, Melkor creates with singing. C.S. Lewis likewise in Narnia, Aslan sings the cosmos into being. In the Silmarillion, it's Melkor sings a song of discord, introduces a note of discord into the cosmos. That's how the fall begins, as it were. It's a sort of a musical retelling of, I think, what we can see in Hesiod's Works and Days, or his Theogony. But again, connecting it to music, very profound, although very subtle use in Tolkien's genealogy of the universe and so forth. But here, as I say, there's a call to the speakers to come, or the citizens to come indoors from across the water to come to their fires and go to bed. So Milton has caught how the sound of a bell is louder when it crosses the water, while seeming to come from afar. There's this strange sense. I don't know if you've ever had it when you hear a sound cross a water. It seems far away, and yet at the same time, it sounds louder because it's reverberated, it is echoed. I'm sure somebody who had better understanding of physics and could explain to me that would be able to explain that curious sense that the sound is far away and at the same time is louder than if we were physically present where the bell itself was rung. So the bell is rung, and he notes that oft on a plat of rising ground I hear the far off curfew sound over some wide watered shore, swinging slow with sullen roar. Now the roar here, roars can be associated with simply noise, the roar of a crowd. In our day, often associated with that. Milton calls it sullen here as well. Now, sullen often has psychological import in our contemporary lexical usage. I think there's a little bit different here. There's a sense more of a roar, which is contemplative again. It's informed by the moonlight that they're under. Remember, it's night, and the references to darkness are here in the poem without the sense of a theological vacuity. I mentioned that in the introduction to Allegro and Il Penseroso. We mustn't see the light and darkness of the two poems as a reflection on good and evil, because there is another association of light or darkness in Scripture in which both of them have connotations of God. Most famously in, as I say, the Exodus narrative, where God is leaving his chosen people through the wilderness in a thick darkness by day, this cloud, and with as a fiery pillar by night. So light and darkness, but both of them connected with God. And the same in Mount Sinai. There's a darkness there as they rise up there. So the darkness is not necessarily associated with the absence of God. That's a different association for different reasons. So we just need to attend to what the author signifies by that, whether he means an Augustinian sense of and theological sense of light and darkness, or if he's talking about two different experiences in which God can nonetheless be present, which is the way Milton uses light and darkness here. So what he has in mind here with the light of the moonlight, because it's a full moon, so there is light, is that the forms of things are irradiated in the midst of the night, and so the peaceful, the curfew bell is sounding. It's not peaceful, it's not calm, it's sullen, and it is roaring. And we then shift images. We shift images from the outdoors where the curfew bell is sounded to the indoors where he has called those of the town who've heard the bell indoors. And we find ourselves in a room beside a dying fire. And we are now in a country town. We're not in London, for instance. There's a rapid shift of vantage point here, which we are transported from the scene of the rustic cottage very quickly thereafter. I see my time is running. Not to the towered cities referenced to in Allegro, but to a solitary, high, lonely tower, line 86, a place more historically associated with contemplation, just like the solitary monk, let's say of a Saint Cuthbert, of a cell, a mossy cell he refers to elsewhere, where a holy man will withdraw in order to contemplate God and devote his mind to contemplation and banish the noise of the world and the hurly-burly of life and the cares and concerns of life. That is where he withdraws here, some high lonely tower where I may oft outwatch the bear. And then references the four Neoplatonic deities, the four elements in the next line, with thrice great Hermes, or unsphere the spirit of Plato to unfold what worlds or what vast regions hold the immortal mind that hath forsook her mansions in the fleshly nook. So again, the realm of contemplation outside the body, as it were, as if one were capable of doing so. The fleshly nook reference to the body, I believe here. It's as I say, contemplating the musica mundana. And we see some signs here of an exuberance in this contemplative man, not poring so much over a scholastic tome, but more over the universe itself, calling down the spirits of Hermes Trismegistus and of Plato, and questioning these two figures. The Hermes here is a mystical figure. Plato, obviously the famed philosopher, and he presents himself not as reading so much as contemplating. And what is he contemplating? He's contemplating interestingly, despite the fact that he's saying he's contemplating, not reading, he's contemplating the significance of the tragedies of ancient Greece and later ages. And that is presented in line 97. We see that these are not in fire, air, flood, or underground, whose power hath a true consent with planet or with element, but sometime let gorgeous tragedy in sceptred pall come sweeping by, presenting Thebes or Pelops' line, or of the tale of Troy divine. So contemplating the meaning and the significance of the plays dealing with the Oedipian dynasty, the house of Atreus, the Euripides that's presented in Euripides' Trojan Women and in Hecuba. So the tragic and what he will do here, which he already did in his companion piece Allegro, is reference the theater. Now, in the theater that was envisaged in the previous poem, he talked about Johnson with his learned talk, and noble Shakespeare fancy child warbling his native woodwotes wild. But in those cases, he's referring to the comedy. Remember, that fits Allegro, the cheerful life. Here he has in mind the tragic vein of theater, and he will thereby make reference to the different apparel being worn in the tragic stage, and chiefly that of the boots that one wore and clopped around on. But let me read a little extract here from it, and then we'll say more. Or what, though rare of later age, ennobled hath the buskined stage? Oh, but oh, sad virgin, that thy power might raise Musaeus from his bower, or bid the soul of Orpheus sing such notes as warbled to the string, drew iron tears down Pluto's cheek, and made hell grant what love did seek, or call up him that left half untold, half told rather, the story of Cambuscan bold, of Symbol, Campbell, and of Algersife, and who had Canis to wife, that owned the virtuous ring and glass, and of the wondrous whores of brass, on which the Tartar king did ride, and if aught else, great bards beside, in sage and solemn tunes have sung, of tourneys and of trophies hung, of forests and enchantments drear, where more is meant than meets the ear. Thus night oft see me in the pole career, in the pale career, till civil suited morn appear, not tricked in frounced as she was wont, with the Attic boy to hunt, but kerchiefed in a comely cloud, while rocking winds are piping loud, or ushered with a shower still, when the gust hath blown his fill, ending on the rustling leaves, with minute drops from off the eaves. And when the sun begins to fling his flaring beams, me, goddess, bring to arched walks of twilight, groves, and shadows brown, that sylvan loaves of pine or memorial oak, or monumental oak, where the rude axe with heave stroke was never heard, the nymphs to daunt, or fright them from their hallowed haunt. Referring here, as I say, a variety of classical allusions here, ranging from the tales of Troy, mentioned obviously in the classical epics of Homer, but also the very basis for the tragedians in their plays, to the reference to Musaeus in line 17, who's a poet rather, who's praised by Plato. I think we have no works of his that we have received, or even a reference back to Orpheus. Now, Orpheus was referred to in Allegro, and the cheerful way in which he was said to be able to enchant the beast to follow him, and in fact, his song was so pleasing it led him down to the underworld to Pluto, and allowed him to receive the promise that he could bring his wife back with him if he did not look behind him, and of course he did so. Here he's invoked yet once again, and so not associated with cheerfulness, but equally claimed by both the comic mode, if you will, and the tragic mode. Both of them draw upon a sort of music that's connected with the musica mundana. Both of them are making this claim. Other references here are probably to Chaucer. Call up him that left half told the story of Cambuscan bold, or Campbell, or Algersife, and who had Canis to wife, Chaucer. And goes on through a variety of references here. So this is these then become rather difficult moments, I think, to follow for the reader. When we get through these passages without some sort of, at least, direction. And we get to, let me pull down here to, where did I leave off? I left off at the haunt. There in close, let me just read it, and then I'll comment then. There in close covert by some brook, where no profaner eye may look, hide me from day's garish eye, while the bee with honeyed thigh, that at her flowery work doth sing, and the waters murmuring, once again, listen to the music everywhere, the sound, with such consort as they keep, entice the dewy feathered sleep, and let some strange mysterious dream wave at his wings in airy stream, of lively portraiture displayed, softly on my eyelids laid. And as I wake, sweet music breath above, about, or underneath, sent by some spirit to mortals good, or the unseen genius of the wood. But let my feet never fail. By the way, in Milton, the word "but" is is a significant word. It's a turn. It's a volta within the poem. He turns direction when he does that. So at the outset, when he finished the apotropic proem, he moves then to but. So hence, thou vain deluding joys, but hail thou goddess. Likewise here, the but signals a shift. But, he says, let my dew feet never fail to walk the studious cloisters pale, and love the high embowed roof. This is an indoors, more of a, maybe of a church context, or a temple, with antique pillars massy proof, and storied windows richly dight, richly inlaid, casting a dim religious light. There let the pealing organ blow to the full-voiced choir below, in service high, and anthems clear, as may with sweetness, through mine ear, dissolve me into ecstasies, and bring all heaven before mine eyes. And may at last my weary age find out the peaceful hermitage, the hairy gown and mossy cell, where I may sit and rightly spell of every star that heaven doth show, and every herb that sips the dew, till old experience do attain to something like prophetic strain. These pleasures melancholy give, and I with thee will choose to live. So he concludes that desire expressed to dwell with melancholy. Hence, deluding joys promised by Allegro. But hail, goddess of melancholy, divinest, whose saintly visage is too bright to hit the sense of human sight. That same, so he's appealing not to the worldly sense of light, the physical light, but rather that sense of spiritual light which he will invoke so strongly in Book 3 of Paradise Lost. The eyes of the mind irradiate, he says in Book 3, towards the end of his invocation, or roughly line 50. Similarly here with melancholy. So it's a more spiritual sense, more of a disembodied sense in the classical sense. And Milton even cites that here, although he does not wholly disjoin the body from the soul, because he repeatedly connects the three types of music that are, again, the inheritance of his Boethian understanding of music, which governs, by the way, Boethius's on the principles of music was a very popular text in the Renaissance. one of the very first musical texts that was printed. It was printed in Venice sometime in 1491, 92, and was repeatedly used. It was used in Oxford University as a musical text all the way into the 18th century. And so, again, this is a absolutely essential sense to understand where he's going with this and how he connects all of the contemplation and the contemplation of the good, the form of the good, the ultimate good, the thing that can't be seen but can be seen with the eyes of the mind, with where he concludes this, which is in something like a church service. Behind the in the storied windows, richly dight, you can imagine the stained glass windows of a church, and an organ, and the anthems clear, and the sweetness which dissolve him into ecstasies. Now, the ecstasies are a standing apart from himself, ecstasis. He's standing out from his body. He's thinking of things that cannot be seen with the physical eye. But the one thing that we're promised in 1 Corinthians 13 is that now, though we see through a glass darkly, then we will see face to face with the spiritual bodies with which our Lord gives us when we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, that we will have life, a life that will transcend that of the physical mortal body and will instead be clothed in a spiritual body. And so he invokes not only the context of a church and a service there, but he calls that for all heaven to be brought before his eyes, line 166, and whether in a hairy gown, the hairy gown, that of the mortification of the flesh, that of the ascetic, the Christian monk of that tradition, in the mossy cell, where he may sit and rightly spell. Now, the spell here, I wanted to say one final thing. Milton's not asking for rudimentary grammatical training. He's talking about spell in the sense of incantation, spell. He may rightly spell, he may talk things as they are, not only on earth, but as they are in heaven. The same sense that Shakespeare has when Prospero uses spells. These are spells in tune with the way in which the world actually works. Same sense that we see in C.S. Lewis when his Merlin is using spells in that hideous strength. All of these things, he says that he would do, he would know, and he would, where he may sit and rightly spell, of every star that heaven doth show, and every herb that sips the dew. So the unification of all these things, the consonance, the harmony that indwells all things, because they were made by the Creator, till old experience do attain to something like prophetic strain. This call here is one that was, I believe, answered in Milton's life towards the end of his life, when he wrote in prophetic strain his great works, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. But I'll leave it off with that. And I've said probably more than I wanted to, but all the same, I hope you found it helpful, and I will see you next time.